Hello everyone and welcome back to the first part of how to paint Loonboss on Giant Squig. In this video I am going to focus on the squig, so let's get to it. Here is the list of colors which I am going to be using on the model. I will leave it down in the description below too. The squig is fully assembled and glued onto the base. The tiny moon spider mutant is not placed onto the base yet, and I primed the model with Doombull brown. I used airbrush and gave 2 coats of paint onto the model to get an even coverage on it. If you do not have airbrush, then I strongly suggest to give a mechanical standard grey prime and then with a medium base brush apply 2 coats of Doombull brown. Same appearance but a little bit longer process. So the first color I'm going to use is Khorne red, and I use a medium size dry brush and I start dry brushing the skin of the squig. Where there is the raised surface, where might be the light hitting, I am giving it a bit more stronger dry brush onto the model. Next up is Cadian Fleshtone, and again I use dry brushing technique. I start dry brushing around the mouth, the bottom belly part, a little bit on the butt cheeks and on the sole part to give a little bit more contrast and transition on the skin. Then I use Kislev flesh, and with a small layer brush I start edge highlighting the sharpest features around the mouth, and on the Cadian Fleshtone dry brushed areas I do a gentle layering on the parts to give it a lighter contrast. For the moment will look too bright, but that is absolutely fine. Later on with the shading it is going to be blended better. Now I'm going to use Druchii Violet Wash, and with a medium shade brush I start applying it onto the whole surface of the model, giving an even coat, not really letting to pull together into some of the recesses or parts. I want an all even shade on the model. Once the Druchii Violet Wash is completely dry, then I use Nuln oil wash and I use a small layer brush and I start applying it onto the recesses to get a nicer, darker finish onto the deepest recesses of the model. I am actually applying it twice, so to get a nice dark tone onto the deepest recesses. Now I'm going back to use Khorne red, and I use a small dry brush and I start dry brushing the flattest areas of the skin and the top raised parts, especially around the legs and on the top part, leaving the recesses as dark as possible, and just a little bit over to the Cadian Fleshtone parts just to blend it a bit together better. Now I'm going to make a mix of Khorne red and Wazdakka red, a 1:1 part ratio. And again, with a small dry brush, I start dry brushing some of the sharpest and top raised surface of the model. It is quite a long process, which I intend to do right now, but what I'm trying to do is to get a smooth transition of the skin from dark to bright. Now to continue with the transition, I use Wazdakka red only, and I use a small layer brush, and I start layering the skin of the squig. Now on some of the flattest areas, I dilute a little bit more with water the paint and just give a bit of wet wash on towards the flatter areas. Once it dries, it gets a nice smoother transition of the highlight of the red. Now I'm going to use Wild Rider red, and with a small dry brush I start dry brushing mainly the top raised area. I want the highlight, the light coming from the top part, so for this way I just start to give a very gentle dry brush with Wild Rider red onto the thighs and the lower jaw part, also the butt cheeks and on the face mainly. Then I switch on to a small layer brush, and on the face especially I start edge highlighting the sharpest features, and again on the flatter areas such as the lower jaw part and the back and the tail, I again dilute a bit the paint with some water to run it more better, and start applying it onto these parts, giving less and less. I still want to show the darker parts as well. Now I'm going back to use Cadian Fleshtone, and with a small layer brush I start edge highlighting around the mouth of the areas which has been previously been washed and dry brushed with Cadian Fleshtone and then Kislev Flesh, following it with then Druchii Violet, and just an edge highlight just to give it back this raised brighter color transition onto the skin. Then some Kislev Flesh, fine highlight, edge highlight onto the teeth around meeting area, just to give the gums a little brighter look. I add just a very little amount on each of the gums. Now I'm going to use Troll Slayer Orange, and with a small layer brush again, I do a fine highlight, especially on the face and around the mouth, and trying to blend together the Cadian Fleshtone and the Kislev flesh part, just a little bit going over to it, to have that blend nicely and smoothly. Around the eye sockets it turned out a little bit too bright in my taste, so now I'm going to use Druchii Violet wash and just apply it around the eye socket just to make it a bit darker. And again I use Kislev flesh on the face, just to pick out the edges of the highlighted areas. I use a small layer brush for that, and I also base paint the poxes that can be found on the squig. Now I'm going to apply Seraphim Sepia wash just onto the pox parts and just a touch around of it to get it a nice blend with the red skin. Once the Seraphim Sepia wash is completely dry on the boxes, I use a Ushabti bone, and with a small layer brush I tap some dots on the top right corner of each boxes. I am going to use now Naggaroth Night as a base color for the tongue. I use a medium layer brush for this. I applied Carroburg Crimson Wash onto the tongue and also the inside of the mouth, which still with the original base color Doombull Brown. I also apply it around the corners of the mouth. I use a medium wash brush for this, being careful around the areas which I already painted. Once the wash is dry, I use Daemonette hide. First I apply it with a small dry brush on the tongue, mainly focusing on the top raised surface of the tongue. Then I switch onto a small layer brush and I start picking out with the same color the sharpest ridges on the tongue, giving already a highlight to it. I also decided to paint with Daemonette the eye bags of the squig. Now I'm going to use Slaneesh Grey and I start edge highlighting the tongue and also edge highlight the eye bags. Then I decided to base paint all the bubbles on the tongue with Slaneesh Grey as well. Now to make it look more different, the bubbles on the tongue I use Druchii Violet. I use a small layer brush and just touch on those bubbles just to get on the edges some definition to make them pop out more. I am going to use Rhinox hide to base paint the claws and the horns of the squig. I use a medium layer brush for this. Now I'm going to use Nuln oil wash on the Rhinox hide areas. On the claws, I do go over with the wash on the flesh area just a little bit to have a nice blending for the darker finish to the skin as well around the feet. As for the horn, it's just a regular normal wash to it. Once the wash is dry, then I'm going to use Gorthor Brown. First I start applying it with my trusty old brush and start dry brushing the horns and the claws. Then I switch onto a small layer brush and I start highlighting the sharpest features of the areas. Now I'm going to focus on the teeth. I use Zandri dust as a base color. I am being very careful, especially around the tongue area. Some parts are hard to reach, so for this reason I use a small layer brush. I also use the Zandri dust just as a fine edge highlight onto the horns, just on the sharpest features, a very thin line, just to make it pop out a bit more. Now I'm going to apply on the teeth some Agrax Earthshade wash. I use again a small layer brush, just in case to keep it control the flow of the wash. Once the Agrax Earthshade is dry, I am going to use Morghast bone, and I start layering the teeth, leaving the deepest recesses untouched, just to get more contrast on the areas. And with Screaming Skull, I finish the teeth. I am using a small layer brush and just do a fine highlight on the tip of the teeth and some rigids just to pop out a bit more. Now I'm going to paint the eyes. I use Averland Sunset as a base color first. I use a small layer brush for this. Just for precaution, I apply it twice on the eyes to get an all even finish on the area. Now I'm going to apply Reikland Fleshshade wash onto the eyes. I use again a small layer brush and just gently applying it onto the recesses. Once it's done, I use Yriel yellow. And again with a small layer brush, I start painting the center of the eyes. Now I'm going to use Abaddon black. I use 2 parts water and 1 part paint. I also use the Psycho brush from the Army Painter, which is the smallest brush I have. And I start making the pupils by making a thin line from top to bottom onto the area where I want the pupils. And I finish the eyes with white scar, again with the smallest brush I have, and I start applying a little mount in this case on the top right corner of the pupils to get a nice highlight to it. And the squig is ready. Now we can move on to part 2, where I will be showing how to paint the rider and the metallic parts and also the base. So stay tuned and thanks for watching. Cheers.